Today, we're going to be talking about one of the most frightening outcomes of the First World War, and that is the rise of fascism. A good place to start the conversation is with the definition of fascism. Fascism is a structure or method for gaining totalitarian power. It is not tied to any specific ideology. It does reject the concept of liberty that had been around since the French Revolution, and it stands in direct opposition to democracy. Fascism uh, believes that democracy corrupts a society. It promotes emotion. It is an appeal to emotion. It also glorifies political violence. Fascists are always seeking to restore what they consider to be traditional values, respecting authority, nationalism, and the glorification of the nuclear family. The propaganda that exists in a fascist society pushes the desire for national greatness, but it also wants dominance over all of the minority ethnic groups in a society. So fascism really represents this marriage of intense nationalism with racism. Uh, and in fact emphasizes the supremacy of whatever the dominant race is in society. Oftentimes, particularly in the early part of the 20th century, fascists are also interested in an aggressive and expansionist foreign policy. Nowadays, in the modern era, modern fascists are less focused on that particular point. But no matter what the period is, the followers of fascism, the people to whom fascism appeals the most, are folks from the lower middle class, the petty bourgeoisie. So shopkeepers, small business owners, lower level civil servants and bureaucrats, and some white collar professionals as well. I mentioned totalitarianism in the previous slide, the system of government that imposes complete control over the people. So you can have a marriage of fascism and totalitarianism, but you can also have a marriage of communism and totalitarianism. It's implementing the ideology that wants to transform society to the advantage of the people who are in power. Totalitarian regimes tend to be single party dictatorships. Totalitarians aren't interested in uh, discussing policy in a reasonable way to come up with solutions that are beneficial to everyone. That's not what totalitarianism is. Totalitarian regimes basically always have a secret police. There's complete control of the media. There's no free press. The economy is controlled completely by the state, so you don't really have free market capitalism in a totalitarian regime. And the education system exists to indoctrinate students rather than educate, really. And so, in the 20th century, fascism and communism are both totalitarian structures. One feature that is always a part of fascist movements are a cult of personality around the charismatic leader. You can't have fascism without having a single individual at the head of the government that people are supposed to follow unquestioningly. Uh, the followers of the fascist movement owe their leader loyalty and obedience. And the leader is the person who defines truth, right? There is no objective truth in fascism other than what the fascist dictator says. Fascism starts in Europe in the early 20th century, and it's an immediate outgrowth of the First World War. Again, fascism appeals to that lower middle class, and so the followers of fascism are reacting to the power of the ruling elites. Right, the societies in Europe were absolutely dominated by elites. Not saying that they aren't now, but much more so in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so after World War I, Fascism was seen as sort of a third way. At that point, there were really only two systems of government in Europe. You had liberal democracies and you had communism, because all of the absolute monarchies are gone after World War One. And for some people, liberal democracy and communism were both unappealing. Again, fascism is appealing to the lower middle class. Uh, Fascists are promising power to the people, even if that's not actually the case. And it's not really surprising that fascism began in the two newest countries in Europe, or Italy and Germany. Both of those countries come into existence in the 1870s, so they're only 50 years old when you get into the 1920s, and what happened in both of those countries is you pulled together lots of different regions that hadn't really been united before. And it was the elites that were doing that. So the people in the rural areas of Germany and Italy weren't being asked about whether or not they wanted to be a part of a greater country. And common people, including the lower middle class, were resentful of the fact that they didn't they didn't get to be a part of the conversation about unification. Before we get into the rest of the presentation, I need to go over some economic terms for you, because economics plays a really important role in the rise of fascism. So just real quickly, some terms. Credit, like a credit card, it's borrowing money and you have to repay it later with interest. Deficit spending, that's when governments spend money that it doesn't actually have, by selling these things called bonds in order to be able to raise money. And sometimes that kind of spending in a society is necessary, and sometimes it really kind of isn't. Inflation, that's a term you might have heard before. It's when prices rise faster than income does, and so that reduces a regular person's purchasing power. If prices go up but your income doesn't go up, then you can buy less because things cost more. National debt. So, if you have a deficit every single year, that kind of builds up. It's the total amount of money that a nation owes. And it increases when you do that deficit spending. Um, and then a tariff is a tax on imported goods, right? So tariffs apply to products that are coming into your country, and they exist for a couple of reasons. One is that they protect domestic industry, right? So in the early 1800s, America had a lot of tariffs on imported goods because we were trying to build our own industry here in the United States. Sometimes tariffs are used in economic warfare. So recently, the United States got into a trade war with China, and tariffs were used as a principal quote unquote weapon in that. But if you have lower tariffs or non existent tariffs, then that's going to generate more international trade. So, from a capitalism perspective, tariffs are really bad. Fascism began in Italy, so that's where we're going to start. You may recall that Italy was actually on the winning side in World War One, not that the Italian people would really uh, know that. So the post World War One government didn't fulfill the promises that it made to the people during the war, land and prosperity. They had high national debt because of the war, and their currency wasn't worth very much. So now you start to see some inflationary issues. You also had high unemployment. When you send all the men to war, then they come home and there aren't enough jobs for them. That's unfortunately a pretty common thing. And there's less trade. Plus, there was a national humiliation at Versailles, which is where they put together the treaty that ended the First World War. Um, the Allies, Britain and France, made a lot of promises to Italy to get them into the war, but then they didn't hold up their end of the bargain. They were pretty solidly disrespected by the British and the French and even the Americans, who played such an important role in the Treaty of Versailles. People were frustrated with liberal democracy because they thought liberal democracy was going to be the answer to all of their problems, and it wasn't. And they felt like they were on the losing end. They had to suffer a national embarrassment because the government didn't stand up to the Allies in the treaty. And as a consequence of that, you have peasants who are seizing land from wealthy landowners. You have workers on strike who are occupying the factories. It was a mess. As a consequence of that, we have the entrance of Benito Mussolini onto the political scene. So Mussolini was a very intelligent guy, very charismatic, very violent, and at least early in the 20th century, before the First World War, he was a draft dodger. He was an anti-imperialist, and so he was a socialist actually when he was a younger person. But when World War I began, he changed his tune a little bit and he became very pro-war because he saw war as a path to that socialist revolution that he was seeking at that time. He did fight in the war. He was wounded, which took him out of the war, and towards the end of the war, he abandoned socialism and became a nationalist. He's an ambitious guy. He wants power and he's looking for a political path that will give him that. He's a revolutionary guy, but he's not really locked into any particular ideology, as was the case in Russia with the Russian Revolution. So in 1919, just after the war, Mussolini founds a new political party called the Fascist Party. The name fascist actually comes from an ancient Roman symbol, and you can see it there on the screen. It symbolizes unity and authority, and so that's kind of where Mussolini got the name. They reached out to a lot of disaffected people in the population. So former socialists who were disillusioned, like Mussolini was, and veterans as well. You have really high unemployment. You have a lot of really disaffected young men wandering around Italy, and so these fascist groups arise in northern and central Italy. Remember, southern Italy is culturally very, very different from northern Italy. And it didn't take off quite as quickly in southern Italy. But northern and central Italy, which was much more urbanized, it became popular. They established, again, we know one of the hallmarks of fascism is appeals to violence. And so they established these paramilitary black shirts, right? And you can see those on the screen as well. That they're kind of foot soldiers for the fascist movement, which is not really a thing that we have anymore, except maybe we kind of do. Opposition to socialism got support from the industrialists. Industrialists were not a big fan of socialism because socialism wanted to take away their wealth and power. So you see industrialists turn towards the fascists once it's clear that liberal democracy isn't going to work. Mussolini got to the point where he was making open threats to overthrow the government, and there wasn't really a strong response against him. 1922, Mussolini and his fascist black shirts march all the way to Rome from northern Italy. I think they were in Milan, to frighten the government into conceding power to Mussolini. It was, he played a card, and it turns out that it actually worked because the king buckled and asked Mussolini to form a new government, which is how it works in a parliamentary system, which is different than what we have here in the United States. So in 1924, they're in power and you have a new set of elections. The fascists rigged those elections and intimidated a lot of their liberal democratic opponents to, stand down or resign if they were in government, so that the fascists could get full control of the Italian government. The military was the most resistant to Mussolini, but they agreed to back him if he didn't get rid of the black shirts, but made sure that the black shirts were sort of integrated into the military structure, so that the black shirts would have to take their orders from the military rather than directly from Mussolini. The military didn't want to have another force in Italy that they might have to contend with. Once in power, Mussolini gets rid of all political parties other than the fascist party, because that is what fascists do, and totalitarians for that matter. So you have press censorship, there are political police, making sure that people are sufficiently loyal to the fascist regime. They had loyalty oaths to that end, and people who were identified as being anti-fascist were tried before military courts, not civil courts. And you have rule by decree, meaning that Mussolini can just say that something is going to be a law now, and it is. You no longer have democracy. Fascists don't like democracy. The economy was capitalistic, but uh, with strong state control. So again, the industrialists are supporting this because they're going to continue to make money. And fascism is staunchly opposed to socialism. Strikes are abolished under the fascist regime, and in fact, Mussolini combines unions with trade groups, right? So you have the workers and the business owners that he's forcing into these associations that would kind of manage every single sector of the economy. They did have high tariffs. Again, Mussolini's trying to stimulate domestic industry, but tariffs usually end up hurting the economy. Swamps were drained, like literal swamps were drained, not metaphorical swamps, and they're cultivated, but the farmers were coerced into growing more wheat to be able to support, all of the various military structures. And as a consequence of that, production actually declines. There's a lot of resistance to fascism in the countryside. And when production declines and there's not enough food, the standard of living goes down, which is sort of the opposite of what Mussolini promised. Mussolini cultivated this idea that he was a man of destiny. He was very good at public speaking. He had very specific poses and facial expressions. And, the masses, or at least the people that were open to fascism, really liked all of that over the top behavior. Um, Despite being involved in the fascist movement from almost the very beginning, women were not given any positions of authority in the fascist movement. They were kind of forced to go back to a quote unquote traditional role of being wives and mothers. You had youth organizations that existed to indoctrinate children as well as to provide military training. You can see some of the little boys that were brought into that. Mussolini really idealized ancient Rome. His goal was to recreate ancient Rome with all of its military power and greatness and cultural significance. He was a megalomaniac. The Roman Catholic Church was very hostile towards the government of unified Italy. And Mussolini knew that in order to have his movement become really powerful, he had to gain the support of the Roman Catholic Church. The main reason why the church was so anti-state, opposed to the Italian government, is because when Italy was unifying, they seized a tremendous amount of land. Virtually all of the land in Italy that had been controlled directly by the Pope got consumed by the modern Italian nation state, including the city of Rome, which had kind of been under the direct authority of the Pope. Mussolini tried to appease the church by creating a new independent country called Vatican City. Which exists within the city of Rome. It's a very small country, but it is still an independent country with the Pope as the head of state. So once Mussolini was able to get that church support, then most religious Italians fell in line and supported the fascists. Needless to say, not everyone was supportive of the fascists. The main groups that would have been opposed to the fascists would have been communists and socialists, but also liberal Democrats. And a lot of trade unions were pretty opposed to the fascists because, they're trying to subvert the authority and make them work with the industrialists. But by the mid 20s, 4 or 5 years after Mussolini took power, Most of the anti-fascists uh, were either in prison or had left the country already. Um, but Mussolini was not a huge anti-Semite. But later in his regime, he was forced to adopt some anti-Semitic practices because he wanted to be able to get along better with Hitler. And that actually alienated a lot of Italians because they were, again, a lot less anti-Semitic than Hitler's regime, than the Nazis. And regular Italian people saw Italian Jews as patriots, as no different than them. While fascism began in Italy, it was really in Germany where the model was perfected under Adolf Hitler. Just as with Italy, to find the roots of fascism in Germany, we have to look at what happened at the end of the First World War. So when the Kaiser stepped down right after the armistice, the Social Democrats were the party that took control of the government, and they formed a new government in a city in Western Germany called Weimar. That's how you pronounce that word, and instead of in Berlin, which was, it is the capital now, and it was the capital during that period. So they form a new city they form a new government in the city of Weimar. And again, it's a liberal democracy. There's universal suffrage. Everybody can vote. There's a Bill of Rights. Looks a lot like our government, really. At that moment, it was one of the most liberal governments in all of Europe. But there was a tremendous amount of chaos post-war, and the government turned to a kind of a right-wing group called the Freikorps, which means free corps in German, and it was a place where embittered veterans kind of ended up, and so you have this liberal democratic government that's relying on the Freikorps to help keep order, which is not a great idea in retrospect, because those veterans end up becoming some of the earliest Nazis. There was an attempted coup. The word in German is Putsch in 1920, but it was put down pretty quickly. The government of Germany that existed from the end of World War I to the rise of Hitler is called the Weimar Republic. Again, it's based upon that city where the government was founded. Um, the regular German people viewed that government with suspicion because that was the government that signed the Treaty of Versailles, which was regarded as a really terrible thing in Germany. German people couldn't understand how they lost the war. They didn't feel like they lost the war. There was an armistice. An armistice is like, let's sit down, stop shooting at each other, and have a conversation about what to do. They resented being forced to take full responsibility for World War I mainly because they weren't fully responsible for World War I. There was just as much blame in France and Russia and Austria. And yet the Allies forced Germany to take full responsibility for the war, including financial responsibility. Both political extremes plotted against the Weimar Republic, communists as well as fascists. Right-wing extremists, people who eventually become the Nazis, pushed this idea that Germany was betrayed by Marxists, communists, and Jews. You had ministers in government who were assassinated. It was a very chaotic time in Germany, and the government really couldn't manage the post-war economy, although it's unclear if anybody would have been able to manage the post-war economy. Massive unemployment, right? All of those soldiers that survived the war coming home. There is no industry left. Everything's, in society is destroyed. So, you have massive unemployment, you have insane inflation. You can see it in that graph right there. People would bring, wheelbarrows full of money to buy a loaf of bread. Women would make a clothing out of money because it was so devalued at that point. And we see a man come onto the scene who takes advantage of all of the chaos and frustration. Hitler's actually not German. He was born in Austria. He was a mediocre artist. The image on the top there is something that was actually created by Adolf Hitler. He was not a very good student. He never graduated from high school. He worked a lot of odd jobs when he was very young. He applied to architecture school, and he was rejected. And he turned pretty early in life to racism and anti-Semitism. He lived in Vienna at that point, and Vienna is a really diverse, multicultural city in Central Europe because it had been the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. All of those different ethnic groups that made up Austria-Hungary and then were split out into separate countries after the First World War, well, they all had representation in Vienna. And so Hitler is reacting negatively towards multiculturalism, which is actually something that modern day fascists also rail against. They believed in the theory that the German race was superior to all other races and had a duty to rule over them, and really kind of put Jews at the center of this idea that the culture was in decline. Hitler wanted to see unity between Germany and Austria, and he, of course, gets his wish at the shortly before the beginning of World War II. Hitler joined the army at the outbreak of World War I and actually did go and fight. He was exposed to poison gas, so he actually wasn't in combat very long, just like Mussolini, actually. After World War I, Hitler would often speak in public about his racist ideology, and he joined and later gained a lot of influence in a political party called the German Workers' Party. Once he gained control of the party overall, he changed the name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or NSDAP. That's the acronym in German because Germans don't call themselves Germans. The name for their country is Deutschland, and so NSDAP became abbreviated as Nazi. And by 1920, the official party ideology matched Hitler's personal ideology. So he creates this Nazi party out of an existing party and applies all of his ideology to it. So he believes in Greater Germany, meaning incorporating Austria and other German-speaking lands, such as in Poland, into a Greater Germany. Anti-Semitism is at the core of Nazi ideology, as I think everyone knows, and really promoting benefits for working class and middle class people, right? The lower middle class, the petty bourgeoisie, the groups of people that fascists always appeal to. Just like Mussolini, Hitler created a paramilitary organization called the SA, which are known colloquially as the brown shirts, right? So Italy had the black shirts. Hitler and the Nazis have the brown shirts. And just like in Italy, the brown shirts attract disaffected veterans, people who had been a part of the Freikorps, and just kind of lost young men who don't really have a place in society, and sometimes even some, kind of thuggish people and criminals join the party as well. Hitler actually tried to overthrow the government fairly early in the 1920s, but it was pretty spontaneous and disorganized. He marched into a beer hall in the city of Munich in southern Germany and announced that he was going to lead an attack on the government. Right, this was not especially well thought out. It collapsed fairly quickly, and Hitler was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but actually only ended up serving 9 months in prison. But that time was enough for Hitler to be able to write his memoir, which is called Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle in English, which became a bestseller in Germany. It's still available to read as a historic document. He's not, so it doesn't really read as something written by a rational person, and it's actually illegal in Germany today. It's a banned book in modern Germany. The leadership of the Nazi Party was established by the mid 1920s, and these four individuals stayed with Hitler for quite a long time. Rudolf Hess, the deputy Führer, was actually the first person to leave. He fled Germany in 1941 and was captured by the British and thrown in prison for the rest of his life. But Joseph Goebbels was with him to the very end. He committed suicide and killed his whole family also, right around the time that Hitler committed suicide at the very end of the war. Hermann Goring actually stood trial at Nuremberg, which was the big trial for all of the former Nazis. He was about to be executed, but somebody slipped him a vial of poison and he committed suicide. Himmler was the head of the SS, which we'll talk more about when we look at the Second World War. But he too committed suicide prior to being captured by the Allies at the end of the war. When the economy of Germany improved in the mid-20s, there was less enthusiasm for Nazi ideology. When things are going well, Nazi or fascist appeals are less effective. But once the Great Depression hit in 1929, that reignited enthusiasm for Nazi ideology. Germany had massive unemployment. It was the worst in Europe, and massive unemployment always fuels extremism. Doesn't matter if it's fascism or communism or whatever. That you have a lot of people who are unemployed. You have a lot of people who are very resentful of the government, and that's fertile ground for any kind of extremism. So severe hardship and fear, you get fascism. The Depression really polarized politics. Both the Nazis and the communists were more popular than the liberal democracy that kind of existed between those two extremes. And, just as we saw in Italy, the industrialists backed the Nazis because they saw the Nazis as the lesser of the two evils. There's no way that you could have industrialists supporting communists. So in 1933, Hitler is asked to form a government, which he does, but at that point he is the leader of a democratic government. He's the chancellor of Germany. And so the Nazis engineered the burning of the legislature called the Reichstag. The Reichstag is a term that we know going all the way back to the 12 and 1300s. That structure still existed. It existed as a modern parliament, but it was burned down. It was burned down by the Nazis. We're virtually certain at this point. Hitler took advantage of that to blame the communists, right? So your people invade the seat of government and destroy the place, and then you take advantage of that to blame the opposition group rather than your own people. And that, of course, gives Hitler the opportunity to start a crackdown on communists and socialists because those are the people that he was blaming for burning down the Reichstag. That also gave Hitler the opportunity to declare a national emergency, which never ends well. And they started jailing all of their political opponents, not just the communists. And so this is the point where we see the birth of the Third Reich, which is the term that is often used to describe Nazi Germany. And the reason why it's the Third Reich, the First Reich was the Holy Roman Empire. The Second Reich was the German Empire that was established in the 1870s, and Nazi Germany is the Third Reich. So Germany had had a federal structure of government, the same that the United States does, in terms of, we have divided sovereignty between states and the federal government. Hitler replaces that structure with a strongly centralized state so that there's no question about who's actually in charge. Nazi Party members replace all government officials, right? You couldn't have a decent job in government in Nazi Germany and not be a Nazi. That's kind of makes sense. Not only did they jail members of political parties, just like we see in Italy, all other political parties are outlawed. And as is what you do in a fascist regime, the Nazis established a secret police called the Gestapo. They built the concentration camps in the 30s. We tend to think of the concentration camps associated with the Second World War and the Holocaust. But those concentration camps had been there since the 30s. Originally, they were for political prisoners, not just, we're putting all of the Jews in one place. And they weren't death camps yet. But there was torture. There were really horrific medical experiments conducted on the prisoners. Hitler was a little bit more cautious around the military aristocracy, that existed for centuries in Prussia. They were very skeptical about Hitler and about the Nazis. They sort of saw them as being upstarts. But the way that Hitler brought the military aristocracy around was kind of the same thing that what Mussolini did, which was to eliminate the paramilitary organization. Now, in Italy, they just put the black shirts under the authority of the military, but Hitler's a little less moderate than that. And so in 1934, there's this event called the Night of the Long Knives, where most of the leadership of the SA, the Brown Shirts organization, were killed. And the Brown Shirts disappear because they're put into military uniforms, usually a part of the organization known as the SS, which managed the Holocaust. The economy improved significantly under the Nazis, at least, of course, before the war. Hitler directed a massive public works program. If you engage in a lot of infrastructure building, that means a lot more people have jobs. So they reforested areas that had been devastated during the First World War, and they drained swamps. That's a big thing for fascists, draining swamps, whether it's literal or metaphorical. They built new housing. They built an entire highway network called the Autobahn, which still exists, which is actually what our interstate highway system is based off of. They had a massive science program. They developed artificial rubber. Rubber is used in so many industrial capacities and automobiles and things like that. But real rubber comes from rubber trees, and if you don't have access to rubber, trees, then it becomes more difficult to get that. So they created artificial rubber. They were pioneers in the creation of plastics, to replace a lot of things for which there were shortages. Unemployment disappears. Living standards rise significantly, but people did trade their freedom for that. Businesses are kind of not independent anymore. They just become an extension of the Nazi Party. Business leaders saw financial advantages in becoming Nazis, regardless of whether or not they agreed with the ideology. And again, just like in Fascist Italy, we see that strikes are prohibited. The Nazis really rebuilt society the way that they idealized it. And so, just like in Italy, even though women were members of the early Nazi Party back in the 20s, they were relegated to the so-called traditional roles of wives and mothers, just as we saw in Fascist Italy. There's a rising birth rate during this period. Again, when economic conditions are good, people feel more comfortable about having children, as opposed to when you're in like a severe economic depression. But you also have improved healthcare during this period. The middle class saw Nazis as promoting the kinds of social transformations that they benefited from, right? So the Nazis are expanding their base of support. We're not just talking about the petty bourgeoisie anymore. You see people looking and seeing their lives improved and saying, maybe sacrificing democracy was worth this. All intellectual and artistic life got directed into supporting the Nazis. And so if you were an intellectual or an educator or an artist who were in any way opposed to the Nazis, things weren't going to go very well for you. You have massive book burnings. Fascists love to burn books. And all art in society had to reflect Nazi values. You see the distribution of propaganda through radio and film, not at all surprising. Clergy were prohibited from criticizing the state. You may recall from many lectures ago that Germany was sort of split religiously. The northern half of Germany was Protestant, the southern half of Germany was Catholic, and it was the Catholic priests that were much more inclined to criticize the Nazi state than the Protestants in the northern part of Germany. And then, just like in Fascist Italy, we see education as being used to indoctrinate children. There's a pretty famous organization from this period called the Hitler Youth, and you can see some of the young men that were part of the Hitler Youth there in the 1930s. Because of the Holocaust, whenever we talk about Nazi Germany, we frequently end up also talking about the Jews. Persecution of the Jews began shortly after Hitler seized power, which is not that surprising given that anti Semitism was at the core of Hitler's personal ideology and the ideology of the Nazi Party. Jews became barred from working in the government and civil service. They couldn't attend or teach at universities, and they were banned from practicing law and medicine, which were professions that had a lot of Jewish people in them. In 1935, they passed a series of laws that are known as the Nuremberg Laws that deprived Jews of all civil rights, which included the right to marry non-Jews. A lot of Jews attempted to flee Germany, but they were turned away by the Western democracies, the Britain, France, the United States. We didn't allow German Jews to emigrate. By the 1930s, the United States was not allowing very much immigration at all coming from Europe. And so, German Jews had few places to go at that point. In 1938, it gets much, much worse. There's an event called Kristallnacht, and Kristallnacht is when the Nazis and their allies conducted coordinated attacks all across Germany. Jewish homes, Jewish businesses, synagogues, all set on fire, destroyed. And after Kristallnacht, Jews actually were barred from leaving Germany for any reason, right? So by the late 1930s, the trajectory towards the Holocaust is already happening. There were some differences between Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany was far more totalitarian than Fascist Italy, and the racial component of the fascist ideology was also much more prominent in Nazi Germany. Mussolini wasn't much of an anti Semite himself, and in fact, his longtime mistress was a Jew, and she was actually one of the early leaders of the fascist movement in Italy. In the 1920s, Mussolini was kind of a mentor to Hitler. Of course, at that point, Mussolini was, the leader of a country, and Hitler was the leader of a political party. Mussolini is also older than Hitler, so that was part of it. But by the 1930s, Hitler was really the senior partner, mainly because the Nazi regime in Germany was more economically successful and more militaristic than was Italy. Fascism did exist outside of Europe. Um, there were right-wing groups that had a limited amount of support in France, in the UK, in the United States, but particularly for the UK and the United States, democracy was more solidly rooted. And generally speaking, in strong democracies, fascists struggle a little bit. Britain had a pretty famous fascist, Sir Oswald Mosley, who led a lot of pro-fascist movements in the 1930s. They had shiny uniforms, they all wore black. But when Mosley started advocating for political violence, the British fascist movement was banned. And in fact, once World War II started, they threw Mosley in jail for the duration of the entire war so that he didn't try to stir up any trouble. We don't really talk about this so often, but there actually was a proto-fascist movement in the United States in the 1930s that was led by a celebrity named Charles Lindbergh. Lindbergh was the first person to fly an airplane across the Atlantic Ocean, and then later, tragically, somebody kidnapped his baby and murdered it. So he was a very well-known guy, but he was also very fascist curious, and he led a movement called America First, which is a term that unfortunately has been brought back into modern usage here in the 21st century. The most successful fascist movement outside of Europe was in Brazil, and the movement was called Estado Novo, which means new state, and it was led by Getulio Vargas. And the Great Depression hit everybody. It was a worldwide event, and it collapsed the world coffee market, right? Americans like coffee, and when nobody can afford anything, then they're not buying coffee anymore. Once the coffee market collapses, that actually gave Vargas an opportunity to conduct a military coup and take over the government. Estado Novo's goals were to build industry, support the middle class, gain economic independence. Brazil's not a colony anymore, but a lot of countries in Central and South America still effectively functioned like colonies, and they wanted economic independence. They created a new constitution. They gave women the right to vote. Uh, Vargas decided to appoint himself as the president. He got a little bit crazier at that point. His fascist movement was actually secretly being bankrolled by Mussolini himself. And by 37, Vargas becomes a dictator and follows that established fascist pattern. You abolish all of the other political parties, you censor the press, you establish a secret police, and you imprison all of your political opponents. So they wrote the book in Italy and Germany, and Vargas followed the book very, very closely. We're going to turn now to the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, as you know, it's a communist state. It's not a fascist state, but totalitarianism kind of exists under both of those models. And we'll take a look at what that's like in the Soviet Union. You will recall that by the 1930s, Stalin has total power in the Soviet Union, and his goal was to consolidate that power. Just like with Brazil, he wanted to make the Soviet Union economically independent. It still relied on a lot of Western technology, and they wanted to be independent. And he wanted to eliminate all vestiges of capitalism. Any part of Russian society that was still capitalistic, he wanted to get rid of that utterly. Stalin established what he referred to as a 5-year plan, and one of the main goals of that 5-year plan was to replace all private property. Private property won't exist anymore. They established a system of production quotas, and those were created by a centralized authority that was controlled by the Communist Party. So it wasn't necessarily rooted in practical economics. They created production goals for every single citizen in the Soviet Union, and those quotas were insanely unrealistic. Bonuses were given out if you met those goals, and if you didn't, it was virtually impossible to meet those goals, then there was punishment if you didn't. This was a ham-handed effort to impose centralized state control on all resources in the society and all labor. The goal was to replace any kind of market economic forces like supply and demand, which is a very unrealistic goal. The first 5-year plan was sort of a mixed bag. The quotas weren't met very often. And when they were met, part of the reason why they were met is because the products were inferior. If you have to produce a certain amount of things in a certain amount of time, and you're going to be punished if you don't, you're going to make that stuff as fast as possible, and the quality is going to suffer, which it absolutely did. But they did double their industrial output in 5 years, which is actually pretty impressive. One of the most destructive policies that Stalin engaged with was collectivization. He wanted to extend the control of the Communist Party out into the countryside, and so he ordered the consolidation of thousands of individual family farms into hundreds of collectives. And the collectives were large farms that were devoted to a specific crop. So actually worked pretty similar to modern capitalist agribusiness. In 1929, all of the peasants were ordered to surrender their land and their animals, both animals that are raised for food and work animals, to the state. Just like within industry, peasants were all assigned quotas, which kind of makes no sense because peasants have no control over things like the weather. Peasants rebelled, understandably. They burned crops and they killed their animals rather than handing them over to the state. That provoked exactly the kind of response that you would expect in a totalitarian society. The police and the army attacked peasant villages. And they ended up actually killing most of the skilled farmers, which makes it harder to grow lots of food to sustain a population. And of course, you can see what's coming there. You have massive famine, and millions of people died as a result of this ridiculous effort towards collectivization. It was a mix of successes and failures, but the legacy of the 5 year plan was pretty extensive. In only 10 years, Russia became the largest producer of tractors and railroad locomotives in the entire world. In 10 years, more than 90% of peasants worked on those collective farms, but they didn't work very well, which means that you kind of constantly had food shortages in the Soviet Union. There was much more urbanization. Cities that had not previously existed grew in Central Asia and Siberia around manufacturing centers. The people themselves suffered quite a bit because of the 5 year plan. Their purchasing power went down as a result of it. And there was a massive psychological toll on the people because they were subjected to intense, endless communist indoctrination. By the 1930s, by the middle of the 1930s, Stalin was like a god in the Soviet Union. He didn't do rallies like Hitler and Mussolini did. He's not really a fascist. But there were posters, there were statues, there were icons of Stalin everywhere. Soviet society was significantly altered. Unemployment disappeared, and people got free medical care, they got pensions, they got subsidized housing, they got free childcare. So a lot of the stuff that is promised by modern day socialists, the Soviet Union was actually able to put a lot of that into practice. They pushed education everywhere in Soviet society. They set up schools in the most remote areas of Siberia, and they really tried to wage war, so to speak, on illiteracy. Women in the Soviet Union had a lot more freedom and opportunity than did women in Germany or Britain or the United States. Now, of course, they didn't have the right to vote because the Soviet Union was not a democracy, but they had the right to an abortion. They had the right to get a divorce without permission from the husband. They had a right to an education. They were able to get jobs in science and technology and medicine. There were a lot of female doctors, which you didn't really see in the Western countries. Low wages, though, meant that women had to work to be able to support the family. So, it was kind of about women's rights, but it was more of an economic thing. And collectivization led to a lot more women working in agriculture. When they said that they were assigning quotas to every person, that meant every person that an adult, and women included. Stalin was an absolute ruler, and he's a very paranoid guy. And a consequence of that was that political terror was a feature of the Soviet Union. He eventually turned the security forces on the elite members of the Communist Party itself. Stalin tended to still feel a little threatened by those guys going all the way back to, the revolutionary period. He went after anybody that he saw as a threat, including just regular, ordinary citizens. And it was very common for people to just be arrested and summarily executed on the orders of Stalin, or just because they seemed like they might be a threat to the state. There was at least one real plot against Stalin from within the Communist Party, and that made him even more paranoid. And a lot of the oldest Bolsheviks were executed, along with a lot of generals and military officers. And then he turned around and he executed all of the leaders of the security services, so that by the end of the 30s, the only people left in the Communist Party, in the government, were those who were unfailingly loyal to Stalin. We're going to turn briefly and look at what was happening in the rest of Central and Eastern Europe. All those nationalist movements that helped spark World War One led to the creation of a lot of new countries in Central and Eastern Europe. You have that whole thing coming out of the Paris Peace Conference, where Woodrow Wilson, the American president, was pushing the idea of self-determination for people. Of course, he only meant white people in Europe. He was not interested at all in self-determination for people, say, in Africa. But you have winners and losers. You have, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. They don't exist anymore. The nations that ended up losing territory were Austria and Hungary and Turkey. And that actually inflamed nationalism in those three countries as well. So we have new countries like Poland. The Polish people had existed forever, and they had had their own country for centuries. But in the in the late 1700s, Poland was divided up between Austria and Prussia and Russia. So Poland's back. There's a new country called Czechoslovakia, which doesn't exist anymore. There was a new country called Yugoslavia, which doesn't exist anymore. And they leaned on a sort of a forced nationalism in those countries to promote unity, even though Yugoslavia had 6 or 7 different, ethnic and religious groups. There were impediments to successful democracy. You don't have a middle class in those new countries. You only had aristocratic people and the peasantry. And so you have foreigners, you have Germans and Jews that are filling that role in these new countries. Illiteracy is very high, a lot of disease, there's a very high death rate. These are not terribly functional countries. And all of these little countries, because of the way that the populations were intermixed for so long, each of these new smaller countries have ethnic minorities, and the dominant group in that country is not at all interested in the rights and the interests of those minority groups. The only countries that actually exchanged populations to sort of get rid of that were Greece and Turkey. So Greece and Turkey fought a little war in the 1920s, and at the end of that war, they agreed that Greece would expel all of the Turkish people that still lived there and send them to Turkey, and Turkey would do the same. They would expel all Greek people from Turkey and forcibly relocate them to Greece. As a consequence of all of this stuff, democracy was really on the ropes outside of Britain, France, and the United States. All of these forces lead to the rise of really kind of an aggressive hyper-nationalism. The governments of Central and Eastern Europe were very unstable, and most of them drifted away from democracy and towards totalitarianism because they just didn't have the foundation that was necessary to be able to run democracy at that point. Dictatorships arise all across that area in the 1930s, and they all bring those totalitarian trappings with them. They all establish secret police organizations. They limit civil liberties, and they don't allow political opposition. But you don't get real fascism in Central and Eastern Europe until right around the beginning of World War II. One of the main factors that stimulated the rise of fascism was the Great Depression, which was a global phenomenon. A so-called boom and bust cycle is very common in economics, and there was actually an economic boom in several countries, including the United States, in the 1920s. You have the short depression right after World War I, but then you get the resumption of international trade, and you have a lot more construction, and automobiles become something that goes from what was a luxury in the 1910s to something that's essential that many people own for themselves in the 1920s. Now the boom was actually financed on a pretty shaky credit structure that collapsed, and that's why we had the depression. There's something called margin trading, and this sounds like, how could that actually be a thing? But people were able to go and buy stocks, the stock market that existed back then as it does now, but they could buy the stocks for only a tiny portion of their true value, and the rest of the value was taken out as a loan. And people didn't seem to think that there was anything wrong with that. Regular people get encouraged to buy cars and homes in the same way with these massive loans. We kind of saw something similar to this in the late 2000s. Small countries got huge loans from big ones to be able to help, build industry and or possibly rebuild after the First World War. But those loans were not realistic. They were never really going to be able to pay them back. Companies also overproduced. They just thought that there would always be a market. There would be endless demand for products like automobiles. This global phenomenon known as the Great Depression started right here in the United States. The New York Stock Exchange collapsed in October of 1929, and every single creditor, every single person who loaned a massive amount of money to a customer who was buying stocks for a fraction of their cost, they turned around and called in their loans. And of course, no one could pay those loans back. So the loaner, the people who borrowed the money, they defaulted. We're talking about entire nations defaulted and the entire global economy collapsed. Industry shut down because if there's no money, there's no demand. If there's no demand, then nobody's buying anything that's being built in factories. And so you have the collapse of industry. In 1932, there were 3 million people unemployed in the UK, there were 6 million people unemployed in Germany, and there were 13 million unemployed people in the United States. The first responses, initially by the United States government, similar practices were put into place in other nations. They put up tariffs, right? They thought, okay, we'll stimulate our domestic industry by putting tariffs into place. But all that did is lead other countries to then put their own tariffs in place, and that just crushed international trade. They also tried price controls for a while. That didn't really work either. The government trying to tell a market economy how much things could cost. Uh, Eventually, though, you see a lot of economies switch to deficit spending. That's where you're spending money that technically you don't have. And they set up public works programs, jobs programs, and those had more success than did tariffs. Most of what we learn about the Depression has to do with the Depression in the United States of America, this is world history, so you got to understand the global context of our Depression. President Herbert Hoover, who was the president in the late 20s and early 30s, did almost nothing to blunt the impact of the Depression. He's a Republican, and the Republicans felt like there was no place for government to interfere in the economy. That was standard Republican ideology at that time. They did, put up the tariff that was even more devastating to the economy. So they didn't really have any tools to combat an economic crisis such as this. When you have an economic crisis such as that, uh, politicians tend to not get reelected. Hoover did not. Franklin Roosevelt was elected president in 1932. And when he came to power in 1933, within weeks of when Hitler came to power, incidentally, he presented an alternative to fascism and socialism. Liberal democracy worked in America in a way that it didn't work in Europe for a lot of reasons. One is, of course, we've had democracy for a few hundred years. In places in Europe, we're talking a few decades instead of a few centuries. Um, uh, Roosevelt put into place the New Deal. And the New Deal was this plan, this set of really aggressive measures to stimulate the economy. And actually, some of them very similar to what Germany did. So you have investments in public works, and you have job creation programs, and you have social welfare programs. So there's this weird thing where Hitler and Roosevelt are putting into place very similar programs, but coming at it through utterly different ideologies. Um, the economy was buoyed, but they really needed World War II to fully heal from the Depression. Again, the Depression hit every country. In Britain, unemployment actually stayed high throughout the 20s, not even before the Great Depression. But Britain did a lot of the work on building a social welfare system in the 1920s, and that actually blunted the effect of the Depression. So some of the programs that the United States didn't put into place until the 1930s were already there in the 1920s when the Depression hit. In France, instability was kind of the standard operating practice throughout all the 1920s. They did have massive rebuilding programs after World War One. They took out big loans from the United States to be able to, rebuild because so much of World War One was fought in France, and that was where there was the most devastation. But you had high deficits because of deficit spending, and you had high inflation, and that led to a lot of political instability in France. But no fascist movement, or at least no fascist movement that was able to gain any kind of power. Thank you for staying for the whole presentation, and for those of you who are very attentive to detail, I apologize for the larger number of typos in this presentation.